This episode is about what's happening in committee meetings recently, where the Liberals are in an unbelievable amount of trouble. You would expect this to be covered by our public broadcaster, given that the issues are so serious, but alas, no. It's as though they cannot understand that Canadians desperately need a chance to see politicians questioned in a forum where actual answers to questions are expected. And they don't need it just to know what is happening in Canada. They need it for their mental health. Watching politicians change topics and obfuscate when asked serious questions causes people a lot of frustration and confusion. And I'm sticking to my theory that they know the confusion and frustration this causes because how could they not, right? You ask them a serious question and they change topics and obfuscate and dilly dally around, talk about unrelated things when asked serious questions. I mean, could they be so simple minded that they wouldn't understand that that causes distress, mental distress? I don't know a Canadian that isn't bothered by that. So they're accomplishing their objective regardless of whether or not they're successful politically. Being more successful politically would allow them to satisfy their urges for longer and for more intense ways. But what they really want to do is they want to cause pain to people's hearts and souls. I really do believe that. What, especially the, I'm not talking about every single, member of the Liberal Party or anything like that, but the upper echelon, the Trudeaus and the Christy Freelands and the David Lemettis and what's that guy that's in charge of security, Marco Mendocino. Yeah, they enjoy it. They enjoy the mental anguish that they cause by obfuscating and lying constantly. It's it's what they want to do. I'm sorry, but I actually do believe that. It doesn't make any sense otherwise, for the reasons that I gave. Could they actually know that by responding to questions in the way that they do that could they actually think that that's not causing distress? So they know that it's causing distress. They're not doing their job. Their job is to inform the public about what's going on. And they continue to do it anyway. I think that they enjoy it. I honestly do think that they enjoy it. So that's what this is about. And it's also a first attempt at creating a full list of Trudeau's misdeeds, which is no easy feat, as I'm sure you can imagine. And a lot of people are doing something similar to this, and that's okay. This is my effort. Um, and what I found is that creating a full list of Trudeau's misdeeds is no easy undertaking, as I said. Anyway, we're going to get to that. However, the Emergency Commission report just came out, and I want to say a few things about that. Okay, and this is the first thing. If you don't understand this, you're not going to understand anything else about it. And the first thing to understand about it is that Rouleau was appointed by Justin Trudeau. That's going to explain an awful lot. He had a liberal bias coming in, and Trudeau could have chosen somebody that didn't have a liberal bias, who hadn't worked with the Liberal Party in the past, but he didn't do it because he's an idiot. Of course, people are going to think that he was biased given his background. And then when he came out with his report, that was biased. Essentially, what happened was that he knew that it wasn't, the invocation of the act wasn't justified. There's no way that you could actually look at the facts of it and not come to that conclusion. But he said, with reservations, reluctantly, I'm going to say that it was justified. No, you didn't. I don't know why people respect that guy so much. And I got to say, right at the beginning, I looked at that guy and I said, there's no way he's going to come back with a fair judgment. And it's going to have a big impact on future lawsuits and things like that. Like the people who want to Sue the truckers for 400,000, no, $4 million, or what is it, 400 million actually, I think it is. Yeah, I think that the citizens of Ottawa are looking for $400 million in compensation for the horn honking. And if they can go to the court and say uh, that it was so bad that the government was justified in bringing in the strongest measures that they can for depriving people of human rights, well, it must have been really serious then, right? The situation must have been really serious. And, it's a lie. Because in reality, that was one of the most peaceful protests in probably in the history of, I wouldn't be surprised, in the history of the world, or in the history of the Western world anyway. We've been dealing with Antifa and BLM. Just, try comparing the truckers to BLM or Antifa. Look at what those two groups did and compare it to the truckers. The first thing you have to understand is that Rouleau was appointed by Justin Trudeau, and so the conclusion of the Public Order Emergency Commission is what you would expect, a whitewash. And that's really bad. Populist movements arise when enough people become convinced that politicians are incompetent, corrupt, and not acting in the best interest of citizens. Sorry. This judgment will be seen as further proof of just how corrupt the system is, and for good reason. Trudeau responded to a shockingly peaceful protest, and that's how I think it was one of the guys. It's definitely a senior figure, and I believe it was with the Ontario Police. Described it as shockingly peaceful. So if you want to look it up, just look up. Security official says that the protest was shockingly peaceful, and you'll find what I'm talking about. So Trudeau responded to a shockingly peaceful protest against his authoritarianism with his most authoritarian move yet, which was the invocation of the Emergencies Act, and was barely criticized in the commission that was set up to examine his actions. There was no strong language regarding Trudeau's insults and taunts, which, according to his own logic, would have prolonged and intensified the protests, thus endangering the citizens of Ottawa. He said they were dangerous, and then he ignored and insulted them. He insulted them himself and through his propaganda outlet, the CBC. It was the truckers' commitment to nonviolence that saved the day in the end. Like, can you imagine if there had been a BLM protest in Canada and the Prime Minister had acted like that? Gotten the CBC to go out and attack them, ignore them yourself, insult them yourself, refuse to meet them. After all that he did to make that protest worse and to cause it in the first place, they still come to the conclusion that the Emergencies Act, the invocation, was justified, even though they didn't need it to clear the borders, even though there was an arrangement between Tamara Lich and the upper echelon of the movement, and I believe it was the city of Ottawa. They had already agreed to start moving trucks um, out of the residential areas of Ottawa. They still invoked the act. It just wasn't necessary. They didn't need it. The threat wasn't serious, and there was a way forward to start clearing it out without using force. Okay, so to come to the conclusion that the invocation of the act was justified, the Liberals made use of a novel, unconventional, and previously unanticipated interpretation of the act, and one that they refused to submit to the Commission, claiming attorney-client privilege. In other words, we have no idea how the Liberals came to the conclusion that it was justified, or, for that matter, how Justice Rouleau did. Because I don't believe that Rouleau was given the legal interpretation that that the Liberals used to invoke the Act. Invoking the Act was right on the surface of it unjustified because CSIS didn't think that the threat was that bad, right? Everybody understood it that way. And so it comes along, we're going to use it. They use it in a way that's completely unexpected. And to justify that, they use a legal interpretation that no Canadian ever had a chance to see and that Rouleau didn't have a chance to see. So they literally decided in the end that the invocation of the Act was justified, despite the fact that nobody's seen the reasoning for that. And there's worse things about it too. Uh, like the head of CSIS making a point of going to cabinet and telling them that the invocation would not be justified. He did that. And the story is that he, at the same time, in a private meeting with Trudeau, said that it was justified, right? And this comes out after months and months of committee hearings and after the commission was going on for a few weeks and it wasn't going very well for Trudeau. Suddenly there's this new story that the head of CSIS had told Trudeau that he would be justified in invoking the Act. I mean, it's just absolutely, it's just berserk. The story is just absolutely crazy. Authoritarians enjoy instilling fear. They like isolating people and like interfering with fundamental human rights and freedoms. And the COVID epidemic gave them the opportunity to do it. The COVID epidemic gave them a chance to really rattle people's minds because that's what social isolation will do. And you would think that they would have taken that into consideration when they started insisting on the lockdowns, trapping everybody in their houses for that amount of time. You would think that the psychologists would have been concerned and that their advice would have been considered. We left the whole thing up to the epidemiologists to decide. Well, that's not how you run things. You ask the epidemiologists, you ask the psychologists, you ask the economists, and you say, what is going to be the impact of this thing, and what should we do? There were no lockdowns during the Spanish flu. I think that's quite a lot worse than COVID. Authoritarians enjoy instilling fear, like isolating people, and like interfering with fundamental human rights and freedoms, and the COVID epidemic gave them the opportunity to do it. That is what the protests were protesting, as well as the excessive mandates and lockdowns that were arguably doing more harm than good at that point. Here's something I picked up from Euronews. These kids, after the lockdowns, had, we already knew, higher rates of depression and anxiety and sadness. But what we didn't know was whether their brains had changed, and their brains had changed. Now get this. They're talking about the changes in the observable changes in brains of children that they have found. This is what they said. Until now, these sorts of accelerated changes in brain age have appeared only in children who have experienced chronic adversity, for example, from violence, neglect, or family dysfunction, according to the researchers. That was from one Nicole Lynn Chang at Euronews.net. Next. Tamara Lich said that one of the reasons she joined the movement was because she was tired of reading about all the suicides, which were up, as were rates of depression, drug and alcohol addiction, domestic violence, porn addiction would have been up. Social isolation does enormous damage to people, and they knew it. People with scrambled minds are easier to control. I think that's a really big part of what's happening, just generally speaking, in society. So, the third thing, people are pushing for changes to the Act, but none so far have pushed for changes that would take the power to appoint the judge away from the party that's being investigated. I haven't heard anybody talk about that. you didn't get a sensible ruling because the Liberals hired the person that was going to be in charge of analyzing the situation. I mean, that's just nuts. But you can be sure the Liberals will push for changes that make the act easier to invoke. Well, that's what Paul Rouleau himself is doing. And I've heard talk of the Liberals want to make it easier to invoke as well. So in this case, they invoked it when it wasn't necessary. And from that, they come to the conclusion, well, we need to make it easier to invoke the next time. The act can only be invoked justifiably if a serious threat exists which cannot be handled in any other way. Neither condition existed. The police had a plan for a peaceful end to the occupation, which Trudeau said was no plan at all. And if other police or security forces had thought they needed the act to be invoked, they would, you would think, have asked for it. In fact, none did. It's certainly worth pointing out that at the same time the act was invoked, the Senate had concluded that the emergency had passed and would have voted against the invocation. So the police didn't ask for it. The Senate had decided that the emergencies no longer existed and would have voted it down. So neither the security forces nor the Senate agreed that the act was necessary, but Rouleau concluded that it was justified. It's preposterous, of course. Okay, anyway, do you remember when we started, I said that this episode is about what's happening in committee meetings recently? So now we'll get on to that. This guy's garage on YouTube. This is fantastic stuff. If you want to see the Liberals finally being asked pointed questions in a place where they're expected to give honest answers, that's the channel for you. It's not the only channel that covers committee hearings, of course. CPAC runs them too, but this guy's garage is really good. Okay, the thing we have to understand here is this is not a situation in which there are good intentions on both sides, with the only difference between them being ideas about how to move the country forward in a positive direction. There are not good people on both sides, not politically. So when I talk about Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland and the rest of them, and I say that they're not good people, they're not good people politically. They're not good people for the country. They may be good people in other areas of their life. I think that's entirely possible. But politically speaking, if you're a supporter of Justin Trudeau at this point in Canadian history, there's got to be something seriously wrong. Because I don't think that there's any way that a good, intelligent, and informed person could still be supportive of the Liberal government. I think that's just an impossibility. So if you have people that are still in support of Justin Trudeau, they're in the cabinet, they're in the party, and they think that we need more of this government, then there's something wrong. Either they're not good people, either they're not intelligent people, or they're not informed people. If you have a good and intelligent and informed person, it's an impossibility that you could decide that government was good for the country. They've done so much damage on so many levels, economically, in terms of national unity. None of the members of Trudeau's cabinet can be considered good, intelligent, informed people. Good people can eventually arrive at compromises, as is expected of politicians in a democratic system. But that seems a less popular mindset today. You have to understand that the goal of cultural Marxism is just to essentially just destroy everything. Destroy the family, destroy civic society, destroy the political system, destroy democracy. and all the rights that go along with that. Because once you can destroy those things, then you can have you can impose a dictatorship because people won't have anything else. That's been the plan for a long time. James Lindsay is probably the best person to listen to about cultural Marxism. Anyway, good people don't do business with consultants who help supercharge opioid sales for big pharma. And they definitely wouldn't give them $140 million for doing nothing. Even members of the public sector are so incensed about it that they blew the whistle. That's extremely rare for public servants to do that. And they did it again with the Chinese interference in the election. CSIS operatives leaked that story to the press because they thought the Canadians needed to know. So, yeah, that's another preposterous thing that Justin Trudeau has done recently. So, some CSIS operative considered not just the threat of Chinese interference in Canadian society to be so dangerous, but also the Liberal government to be so dangerous. So what he does is he releases this information that China interfered in our elections and that Trudeau essentially let them do it. And Trudeau's first reaction is to go and say, well, okay, we definitely have problems in CSIS, that's for sure. And we need to figure out where the leak came from. Instead of coming out and saying, okay, it appears we really do have a problem here and we need to do something about it. He decides to attack the people who blew the whistle on the whole thing. Would good people set bail conditions so light that repeat violent offenders are frequently free to roam the streets where they are almost guaranteed to reoffend? Would good people do that? No. Would people with good intentions borrow and give away COVID money like they were running a popularity contest, as Bill Morneau suggested that they did? Not likely. Would they prorogue Parliament to avoid being accountable to the people of Canada? Would they get caught up in so many ethics violations? Would they engage in flagrant overspending on luxurious living while many in the country struggle to survive? Of course not. And as awful and frightening as it is to imagine, there's still actually a chance the Liberal and the NDP can manage to put together another coalition government despite all the corruption and incompetence, despite the arrogance and hypocrisy, and despite the massive damage they've done to the country economically and in other ways. They can do it by maintaining a stranglehold on mainstream media and by buying enough votes with salaries, contracts, grants, benefits, and promises of benefits. That's what they've always done, are doing now, and are going to do a lot more of in the future. They're doing it like crazy now. Just watch a House of Commons debate and see how often they bring up this idea that they're going to give away so much more than the Conservatives will. They caused the inflation that the country is experiencing by borrowing too much money and pumping it into the system for too long. That's not the only cause of the inflation, but it's one of them. To put it bluntly, they've created economic havoc that's going to lead to a lot of suffering and even deaths, because that's what poverty produces. Suffering and deaths, suicides, alcoholism, drug addiction, homelessness, and crime. We know the drill. We're getting used to this in Canada. Meanwhile, they hired way too many federal employees, raised taxes too much, and hamstringed the oil and gas sector. That drives up the cost of oil and gas and everything else, but starves the federal government of a sizable tax base, and without doing anything much to stop climate change. I wouldn't be surprised if a full analysis was done. Their efforts to combat climate change did more harm than good. Because all they did was force other countries to buy oil from less friendly countries with poorer labor and environmental standards. Revenues from the sale of Canadian oil and natural gas could have funded mass transit projects and alternative energy projects in Canada, especially small nuclear and probably hydro. We failed to control what was in our control, namely our own energy generation and consumption, and attempted to control what was beyond our control, namely the energy consumption habits of people in other countries. This government probably had a negative impact on climate change because under this government, we did not manage to provide Asian countries with the natural gas they wanted to replace coal as a source of energy. That's massive. This is coming now, but would have been faster and more substantial under a more sensible government. This mistake will have a profound impact on quality of life in Canada because of reduced tax revenue for a very long time to come, and especially in the short term, because we're in such a mess right now. They brought in too many immigrants. That pushes up the price of housing and overburdens the medical system. Now that everything is all screwed up economically, they'll rush in, savior style, with government jobs, contracts, benefits, and promising to pump that much more money into the system. Polyev plans to lower taxes and reduce the size and cost of government. That will threaten the economic comfort and security of a lot of people, and the Liberals will feed off of that. They'll especially target recent immigrants, of which they've brought in nearly 1 million in the last 2 years. Like, immigration into Canada, the numbers just keep going up. That's a major voting bloc that could have a tremendous impact on the election, particularly as immigrant-rich areas of the country tend to be securely in Liberal control. Their, their MPs are Liberal, their schools are Liberal, and the media available to them is Liberal. Between recent immigrants, many of whom I am positive would dump Trudeau like a hot potato if they really knew what he represents. So, between recent immigrants and the number of people making a living from one form of government largesse or another, and the more radically inclined feminists who love the preferential treatment on everything from cabinet to faculty positions to government contracts, they'll definitely vote either NDP or Liberal. There's a lot of money in feminism. A good portion of them would, I suspect, vote for whoever they thought would give them the goodies, the money, the jobs, in a large part because they actually need the money. Teachers will vote for him. There's not a chance they'll vote Conservative. And certainly they've been discouraging children from appreciating anything about conservatism. Like, when was the last time, do you think, that anywhere in a university or in a high school, anybody would explain to them that at the heart of conservatism is simply a love for the way things are? That at the heart of conservatism, what you find is love. They're willing to change, but they're not willing to change radically and too quickly. Because if you look at history, those sorts of changes, generally speaking, lead to disaster. Okay, there are two positives, however. One is that a lot of people from India, and particularly Hindus, I think, this is a little bit new to me, but it's really is surprising what I've found. A lot of Hindu people, at least, seem to hate Trudeau more than we do, and I would imagine Filipinos have no time for him either. Unfortunately, because of Chinese Communist Party influence in Canada, I think that if past experience is anything to go by, it appears that Trudeau can count on votes from Chinese people. That is so sad to me. And I hope that changes quickly. Anyway, I watch news from India, and often contains criticisms of Justin Trudeau that come from. I'm sorry. I watched news from India, And if you listen to them, their criticisms of Justin Trudeau sound like criticisms that come from the so-called far right, the right wing. They argue that he's constantly making things worse. And why India would be so interested in Canadian politics, I don't know. I mean, it's part of it would be because a lot of Indians want to move to Canada, but Canada's not the only place. You know, there's people that don't pay attention to alternative media, and one of the things they wouldn't know is that Canada's famous for electing this dimwit for prime minister, and a number of times. The whole woke ideology that seems to have captured Canada, we're famous for that. We're famous idiots. A lot of people feel that way. You'll see broadcasts from Australia or England or India. Like, who would have expected that? The United States. They just think that we're crazy. But we're also really famous for the Freedom Convoy and really well respected for that. Not with everybody, of course. There's still a lot of people who think Justin Trudeau is great, I would imagine. Uh, but the people who still admire him cannot be good, intelligent, and informed people, because a good, intelligent, and informed person would not be impressed with Justin Trudeau, to put it lightly. Anyway, I'm watching the Indian news, and they're saying the same things. They're saying he's a tyrant and a clown, right? Which to me is really reassuring. It's completely normal to feel anxious and even angry when the democratics of your community, city, and even your country begins to change, as has been happening and will in all likelihood continue to happen. For one reason, because business people want more customers and more workers, and because the old stock is old and not reproducing itself in sufficient numbers. Pierre Poilievre might try to lower those numbers somewhat, but not by much. This would be a horrible thing if the people coming in did not seem to be of such high quality. And the thing is that the immigrants that have been coming into Canada for quite a long time now have been quite a bit better educated than the average Canadian, and younger. And they're the type of people that have got it, together enough to emigrate to another country. These are young, well-educated, smart, motivated people, and I think that the reality is that for a lot of Canadians, they're just realizing we're being outclassed here, right? Which isn't obviously isn't saying anything negative about the immigrants coming in, but it's still difficult. The left is always talking about how compassionate they are, but they never seem to have any compassion for people who might feel upset that things are just changing so fast, right? They don't have any compassion for the feelings of people who look at the fact that uh, that one year there was something like 50 churches burned down, big, beautiful churches, some of them burned down, or people tying a rope around uh, Queen Elizabeth and dragging it to the ground, Queen Victoria as well. Anyway, immigrants bring a lot of energy and motivation to a population that, for a lot of reasons, seems to be losing theirs. I think that the problem that you're seeing with white people in so many places, because I don't know what it's like for anybody else, but in where I live, white people are really not doing very well. They quite often just look kind of crazy and weird, and they don't have much money and like that, right? They're not doing well. What is it? I think that it's a couple of things. I think it's the history of alcoholism and drugs has really done a lot of people in. And then add to that this woke nonsense, and that explains it. That explains a lot of it. Anyway, it's probably true that without immigrants, it would be impossible to maintain our public pension schemes, for example. Last I looked, most Canadians think the immigration rate should be at about 300,000 per year. That sounds right to me, but I think there should be more screening for English proficiency, and I think Roxham Road should be closed. Honestly, I think that if we're welcoming to our new citizens, which we are anyway, we may be surprised at what delightful new neighbors we have. My only point is that the number of new arrivals is very high, the highest in Canadian history during the pandemic, and now still high as we struggle with serious inflation. It's just too high. My guess would be that a lot of immigrants think the same thing. Okay, so what's happening recently, that this is not just recently, I'm sorry, but for quite a long time now, a lot of people who become permanent residents of Canada just decide, nah, forget it. I'm going to move to another country. That's happening more and more. So that they're coming here, they're looking to become citizens, and they achieve permanent resident status, and then they just give up and leave. Trudeau has captured the immigrant vote for a long time. The Liberals and the NDP have done that for a long time. If that continues and Canada's in a situation where we can't get rid of a guy like that, a party like that, because of the way that new immigrants are voting, people that haven't lived here long enough to have a sense of what's going on, that's going to create a lot of resentment. That situation can't continue, and I don't think that it will. Another positive is he's going to lose big time with women who aren't that dependent on the government and probably highly taxed. I mean, that's the way that it works. Um, you're either on the payroll or you're paying too much money out in taxes for people who are on the payroll. And there's a lot of women who aren't demented by ideology. It would be a serious mistake to underestimate the number of women who are tired of identity politics, fear of growing woke authoritarianism, and very much concerned about the impact that this government has had on quality of life. He's going to lose a big chunk of the female vote that he counted on in the past. Women generally are more women are okay, yeah, sorry, I can contradict myself a little bit. Okay, women, not all, of course, are responsible for the mess they helped create by electing him. And that should be remembered and pointed out. You have to learn from history, or you are destined to repeat it. I think it was Aldous Huxley a little while ago said that the greatest lesson from history is that people don't learn the lessons of history. That's the most important thing to know about history, is we don't learn from it. What you're seeing with the Trudeau government is reminiscent of authoritarian movements of the past. The corruption of the media, censorship, propaganda, refusal to obey the law. You know, he violated the principle of judicial justice with the SNC Lavalin thing. That alone probably should have ended his career. Anyway, uh, if we don't want another episode of this kind of thing, we need to know what actually happened. And what actually happened is a lot of women voted for him because they thought he was handsome and sexy. Let's face it. And that he would shower them with praise and unearned privileges. The first part about him being so sexy is hard to believe now, but his looks were practically all they talked about at the beginning. Anyway, I think this has changed. He's going to lose a lot of the female vote when the practical consequences of his actions really start to bite. The inflation, the national debt, dysfunctional hospitals, airports, and immigration departments, the scandals, embarrassments, the hypocrisy, incompetence, and corruption. I can't imagine that there aren't, an awful lot of women who are not as enthusiastic about him now as they were in the beginning. Polyev may just win a majority, and a coalition with the NDP is maybe not totally out of the question. Um, when I first heard people say that, I thought that's just bananas. That's not going to happen. But the people who were saying that seemed to be pretty reasonable and knowledgeable. So, okay, maybe it's a possibility. Doesn't seem likely. I think a more likely scenario is that workers who have been wanting the NDP to focus more on workers' rights and benefits instead of pushing discriminatory woke policies will simply vote conservative for a change. There must be loads of NDPers who are totally tired of Jagmeet Singh propping up his failed government. Trudeau's going to lose. And I had that sentence all by itself and to emphasize my confidence of it. But if I'm so confident of that, why would I be doing this? Anyway, it's fun to remember the scandals and screw ups, and we should keep an up to date list just in case. Remember, that's what this is about. I'm going to try to put forward a first draft on a list of all of his screw ups. It won't be complete, and there should be probably a paragraph of commentary on each one of these. Maybe I'll get to it. Maybe somebody else will get to it. I mean, there's a lot of people that are writing about how bad Justin Trudeau is, but I just find it a little weird that nobody's attempted a complete list. Maybe they see the difficulties of doing that, or think it's essentially impossible because he, you know, has done so many ridiculous things. Anyway, I think a complete list, or a list that's as complete as possible, I think would be useful. We should keep an up to date list just in case, just to have them available for conversation. For conversation, discussion, and debate. Not that that's likely. The left doesn't believe in open, honest debate so much as controlling the narrative. Besides, they know they would lose the debate. The question is JT a disaster for democracy in Canada? Will never be debated in a formal debate. You're not going to see that at Monk. It should be debated. Why isn't it? Because they lost the moral high ground years ago. That's why. Moral people debate important issues openly. I mean, I used to see radical wokies in universities. They would actually say this. They would say that debate and critical thinking is a tool of white supremacy. So they actually don't want a debate where people are making use of their critical thinking skills to come to intelligent conclusions. They actually think that is a tool of white supremacy, which it could be. It wouldn't be a good tool because uh, if you argued for white supremacy and were at the same time engaged in a critical thinking process in debate with other people, you wouldn't win. You couldn't win. But the problem with this is that debate and critical thinking could be used by anybody. And I don't think they hesitate to use critical thinking when it comes to their own arguments. Anyway, there will be conversation, as there should be. There will be discussion, and let's face it, arguments. So I've begun work on a list of scandals, failures, and screw-ups. Perhaps someone will find it useful. Another brilliant reference is the YouTuber This Guy's Garage. Sorry, I just got to plug this a few times. He watches federal committee meetings looking for those moments when opposition parties have an opportunity to ask pointed questions of the ruling party and in a forum where actual answers to questions is what is expected. That alone is precious. In committee, the Liberals can attempt to avoid and obfuscate as usual, but not without being interrupted by someone saying something like, let the record show that the minister refuses to answer the question, and cutting them off. Like, wouldn't you love to see that? You ask them a sensible and important question, and they run off someplace with an answer that's not even closely related to the question. And wouldn't you just love to see someone say to them, look, this is an official hearing. Your answers are going to be recorded. We only have a certain amount of time here. You're not answering the question. That's it. I'm cutting you off right now. And it happens. There has to be millions of people who would love to see that. I mean, let's say the conservatives are questioning the liberals. It's not as if they can just say, okay, you're not answering the question, cut. Uh, the chair needs to agree with that assessment, I think is how it works. The channel would definitely be shared widely, I think, this guy's garage, and more people would get a better idea of not only how incompetent and corrupt this government is, but also how dead to rights they've been caught. If you watch the committee hearings on the invocation of the Emergencies Act, it was obvious from the beginning that it wasn't justified. We already knew that. We knew that before the commission started. We're living through a momentous time in Canadian history right now, and a lot of it is happening in committee hearings that very few Canadians even hear. Let's look at some sections of committee hearings that he has uploaded just recently. McKinsey, ethical, yes or no? From that one, I think you'll get a pretty good summary of that company's misdeeds and a lesson in avoidance from the Liberal minister. Number two, this is a really important one right now, of course. Chinese Communist Party dating apps and election interference. Drawing from Australian experience, we see that China is perceived there as being perfectly willing and able to interfere in elections, but that in Canada, since it happened in such a way as to put the Liberals in power, nothing much is shared or perhaps known about China's effort to see Little Potato re-elected. Well, a lot more is known now, and was talked about a lot in the media before, and it would have been obvious to anyone anyway. Do I think the Liberals would welcome their interference? Yes. There's very little that I would say was beneath them. They rewarded a company that helped supercharge opioid sales. They helped supercharge the opioid epidemic. And they used the COVID epidemic to reward rich friends at the expense of the taxpayer. Bill Morneau said that he used COVID vaccines as a wedge issue, and that he gave money out as though he was engaged in a popularity contest. So, like, that is just as bad as it gets. He's going to divide the issue on the vaccine issue, call people that have questions, reasonable questions about the vaccine, call them all kinds of names, and then he's going to reward his friends with all this money that he's borrowed, and now we're stuck paying back. And really, how bad can this get? They corrupted the mainstream media with tax dollars. If there's any use in a public broadcaster beyond a focus on local news, it would be to provide a balanced, non-ideological news show. We're all concerned about how polarized everything is, how polarized the news is, right? So the CBC could actually do something about that. The CBC could provide a middle-of-the-road perspective on things. And if they did, both sides would listen. It's not as the left doesn't have any point. Of course not. Yeah. So instead of, trying to provide news in an unbiased way, the CBC did exactly the opposite. I mean, I've been watching it recently, and for quite a long time, it was just astounding because you would watch it, and every second issue that they covered was some racism thing related to race. Like every single show, there's a some talk about racism. Uh, and the problem is, Canada is the most open country in the world. Racism is not a big issue here. It's certainly not one of our most important questions. And this focus on it probably just increases it. Certainly, what they're attempting to do is to pit groups against each other. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Liberals have been the so called natural ruling party for way too long. Nothing could be more obvious. They would have no problem tolerating Chinese interference in Canadian politics if it improved their chances of winning the last two elections, or for the next one for that matter. I mean, how much ink was spilled covering the supposed Russian attempts to manipulate the last election in. I've forgotten actually how many elections they think that the Russians were involved in. So, Canadian news media is focused on that instead of what was happening in our own country. I think that a lot of what's happening a lot is that in the Western world, the liberals have decided that Russia is the big boogeyman, so we're going to focus attention on that, and while at the same time ignoring what China's doing. China's a million times bigger threat to Canada than Russia. Okay, another good one: Mott's versus Freeland emergency measures. Committee hearings that have Freeland in it are a must see. It's entertaining and astounding and absolutely disturbing. The indolence and the arrogance of Christy Freeland is on full display in those committee hearings. You really do have to see this. I guess I could describe it a little bit. I believe that they were talking about the the financial cost of the blockades. And the truth of it is during the time of those blockades, trade between Canada and the United States was quite higher than the year previously. It couldn't possibly have been as high as it would have been if those borders were closed, right? But the Liberals made a case that that this was doing incredible damage to the country and blah 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 blah. And we all remember that. And so one of the people questioning her was just wanting to know, okay, where did you get these statistics? Right? How do you know this? Where's your study? And she would respond with something like, she's always says this, let me be perfectly clear. My chief concern is that I think that it was reputational damage done to the country, right? She's saying something like that. And I believe that it was Matthew Green is asking, yeah, but what we want to know is the figures. We want to know, what was written down, what was communicated, what sources did you rely on to come to this conclusion that there was a massive damage was being done to the Canadian economy. And she would just repeat it. I think she'd even say, let me be perfectly clear. She'd even say it twice. Let me be perfectly clear. And just not answer the question. At one point, he asked her if she had notes. Did you take notes from the meeting? And she would divert onto some other issue. And it was as if she came into the committee hearing thinking that she was the boss and she was going to go in there and she was going to lay it out. And she thought that people would go along with her perspective on it. When the committee hearing is precisely the opposite. It's when we get a chance to ask them. It's so contemptuous. It's contemptuous of the system and it's contemptuous of the Canadian people. Absolutely astounding. Of course, that should have been on the news. Okay, Green versus Freeland emergency measures. Is another good one. If you'd like to see Freeland's behavior called almost contemptible by NDP Matthew Green from the NDP, this is the video for you. Sorry, I said NDP twice. Yeah, I mean, you should look at his facial expression, his tone of voice, and he was disgusted by her refusal to answer a question. He felt it was disgusting, and you got a chance to see just somebody get pissed off at her. Uh, Another good, this guy's garage is having a party. Here you'll find examples of liberal waste and the practice of hiring consultants to do work that the public service is already paid to do. Ethical, liberal integrity regime, uh, McKinsey corruption scandal, vaccine audit. Here we hear about the 1 billion wasted on expired vaccines, the refusal to release the cost of vaccines, the wasted millions on the Vaccine Connect program, the fact that we're still on the hook for $4 billion for vaccines that there's little demand for, refusal to reveal how much was paid to CanSino for the vaccines that we paid for but did not receive from the People's Liberation Army of Communist China. I mean, it's really starting to add up, isn't it? You know, we had a good idea who he was when he was elected, and that's from the very first time. He did a little bit of a striptease for female supporters of the party. I'm sure that there was, you know, he held his hand out, hoping that these women would pay. And he did a little strip show, and he took off his shirt for a bunch of women. And I know this is corny to just think about it the opposite way, but what would happen if a female politician, especially one that wanted to be prime minister, thought that the way to earn money to support her campaign was doing a kind of a strip show, right? Like, you know, just how preposterous is it? And then at the end of the strip show, she said, you know, my favorite country is China for their basic dictatorship. And then what does he do? He trusts the PLA with our vaccine supply. They ordered from a lot of other companies as well, but a big chunk of it was we were counting on the People's Liberation Army to supply us with their vaccine, and that was when it was really bad. At the beginning, it was a very serious situation. And we were about 3 months late getting the vaccine because they trusted the People's Liberation Army. I mean, how bad can it get? And now we see that they tolerated Chinese interference in the election because it helped them get elected. Right. Deputy Minister of the DOJ refuses to answer a question. That's a good one. Catered affairs and luxury travel. I believe that the Governor General, one trip to the Middle East cost $2.2 billion. I'm sorry, $2.2 million, including $218 for a salad and a $52 bucket of ice. So you wonder, you know, when they're spreading money around like that, you know, what's exactly the benefit? And I think that it's to, if you're wasting a lot of money on luxury items, right? Then the people who sell luxury items are going to like you, aren't they? So that it's just a question of just spreading enough money around and getting people to like you. Borrowed money that people who don't support the Liberal Party are going to have to pay back. When you look at the mess that they've created, just check this out. Check out what the interest payments are on our debt now. I think it's something like $32 billion in Canada. And because of what they did to cause inflation, interest rates going up on everything else. I know that this is obvious, but when you start thinking about mortgage debt, consumer debt, provincial debt, municipal debt, federal debt, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money leaving the country and uh, doing nothing for us. Election interference. The concern here is that the Chinese Communist Party, interfered substantially in the last two elections, and that helped Trudeau win the election. Yeah, that's what I just said. Watch the video. Is the Prime Minister a liar? Is a good one. Broader interpretation. Trudeau lost the popular vote twice and still won, and in part because with the way ridings are allocated, with urban areas being overrepresented in terms of seats. I think that's going to change a bit. It does not bode well for a country when it becomes impossible to get rid of a hated leader, and largely due to the vote of distinct demographics. That's a profoundly hurtful thing. If the Liberals remain in power, a lot of decent, hardworking, honest, and intelligent people are going to become very angry. I mean, what motivated the trucker convoy was a lot of anger. That was part of it, and concern and love for the country. Something that people wouldn't want to hear if they were opposed to the trucker convoy is that those people were motivated by love for the country and for the people who live in it. Anyway, if they win again, if we have to put up with another 4 years or 8 years of that, man, people are going to be angry, and that anger will either go inwards, leading to hopelessness and depression, or it will go out, sometimes in unpredictable and dangerous ways. Often both in the same people at different times, which, just to be perfectly clear, is as far from an incitement to violence as it could get. I'm not attempting to incite violence, I'm attempting to help avoid it. Trudeau did his best to incite violence during the Freedom Convoy and couldn't do it because participants were devoted to nonviolence. But if this coalition of woke dummies, who are in fact destroying the country, actually manages to win power again, I don't know if that capacity for self restraint could be maintained, especially if economic hardship increases. Yeah. If we're stuck with him again and people are suffering real economic hardship, Canada's in for a bad time. But the weird thing about the economic hardship is that it could actually increase his chance of winning votes from the people who want the benefits he would promise and perhaps even provide. Lobbying Commissioner Guts Code of Conduct. Yeah, that's a good one because they're introducing changes that are going to give more power to lobbyists. Clear as mud. It's another one. Would good people push for something like MAID that resulted so quickly in so many obscene results, like veterans being offered assisted suicide rather than money to make necessary home improvements? $14 billion for secret spending. And this is a good one. Former ambassador to China, David Mulrooney, criticizes Trudeau on election interference. Like, that's something that it's absolutely irresponsible that a public broadcaster wouldn't broadcast that. It's just beyond the pale. Totally ridiculous. It's an open and shut case. They've got a responsibility that they're not living up to it. From some other channels, convoy organizer lawyer Keith Wilson relaxed to the emergency. It's on Primetime Politics, CPAC. The scandal no one noticed. That's from Pierre Poilievre. He has a YouTube channel. Here you'll hear a partial explanation of the reasoning behind our beliefs that the verdict made by Judge Rouleau is ludicrous. So about that, here's some other points you might want to consider. David Vigneault, our highest level security official, made a point of personally telling the cabinet that the threshold for invoking the act had not been met. This had been a cornerstone of critics' accusation that the threshold had not been met. Then, towards the end of the public hearings, when things were going very badly indeed for the Liberals, it was claimed that Vigneault had, in a private meeting, told Trudeau that he would be justified in invoking the act and was advised to proceed. That strains credulity. If such a conversation had actually taken place, the Liberal government would have had nothing to lose and everything to gain from revealing that to the public, because it would have helped justify the invocation of the act from the beginning of the hearings. The public had a right to that information. The fact that it came out after months of committee testimony and weeks of commission testimony is extremely suspicious. And to my knowledge, no explanation has been provided to explain that curious state of affairs, and none has been asked. How on earth could it happen that not even the supposedly right wing outlets are not asking that? Maybe there is an explanation, but I've never heard it. David Vigneault makes a point of telling the cabinet that the threshold had not been met. But at the same meeting, around the same time, he tells Trudeau that it was met and that he should go ahead with it. And that news doesn't come out for 8 months. And you believe that? And people could just come to their own conclusion on that. I don't want to be guilty of slander or anything, but what do you think happened? Has anybody there's been no explanation, so I'll go ahead and conclude what I want about that. Okay, here's another curious thing. David Lametti claimed that there was a body of legal opinion that supported the broader interpretation of the Emergencies Act used by the Liberals. Fair enough, that would be useful, but when asked to share those opinions, Lametti refused, claiming solicitor-client privilege. We are, therefore, being asked to accept a legal opinion with no reason given for it. The very least that Lametti could have provided would have been the relevant literature. Short of that, it is reasonable to assume that the literature does not exist, or it does not say what he claims it says. Like, literally, we don't know the reasoning behind the decision that the invocation was justified, and neither did the judge. Even the NDP is suspicious. Solicitor-client privilege is indeed an important principle, but under the statutes governing inquiries in other jurisdictions, it is at times clearly spelled out that professional secrecy cannot be invoked as a shield to stop the commission from getting all the evidence that it needs. Otherwise, why hold the inquiry at all? The legality of the government's action was the crux of what Rouleau had to decide, and Lametti was being singularly unhelpful. Absolutely outrageous. I still remember old Tom screaming at Trudeau, "What kind of man hits a woman? You're disgusting." That was a Trudeau's good for the drama, you know. It the entertainment value is there. Let's put it that way. You know, his dancing around like a fool in India when he went there. That was entertaining and embarrassing. I mean, the whole subcontinent was laughing at what a fool our prime minister was. Anyway, the protest was becoming much quieter by the time the act was invoked. Horn honking much reduced, if not practically eliminated. Crime rates in the area were down. It was safer than if there were no protests. No broken windows, no church burnings, statue topplings, no assaults, no vandalism. Just typical accusations of racist, sexist, homophobic comments that nobody caught on video, despite everyone having a camera in their pocket. Um, it was one of the MPs said that the racist attacks were prominent and pervasive. So they're right in your face. They're going on all the time. And he didn't bother to send somebody out to get video so that you could catch the people that were engaged in this kind of thing to prove their case. I mean, the lefty media and the people who are lefty inclined who claim to be so concerned about this thing could have gone out and captured video of the people of what was happening, shared it with the police, put it on YouTube, and discredited the whole movement. But they didn't do that. They didn't do it because it didn't happen. They're lying. That's what I'm going to conclude. If they're saying that this was going on all the time and nobody got video of it, they're lying. It's a horrible thing. It really is a horrible thing when it gets to the point where uh, you realize that people are willing to do something as nasty as this to create so much division, to try and paint these people as being something that they're not. It's slanderous, is what it is. I mean, really, I don't see why they couldn't be charged with slander. And I'm not saying that there wasn't some. Protests like that is going to attract all kinds of people. So with this election interference thing, it's hard to say whether the biggest threat to Canada is China or Trudeau and his cabinet party and supporters. But with the interference thing, we see that those threats are very much one and the same thing. Though that apparent fact most likely won't be showing up in history books, the state of academia being what it is. I've always interpreted that Orwell quote, he who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future. In terms of the way that the established powers, especially in politics and education, frame our past as though it's just one long series of victimizations of women, people of color, gay people, and now transgender people as well. By creating guilt and an often misguided sense of history, they set themselves up to be the beneficiaries of affirmative action and efforts at reconciliation, which is going to be worth billions and billions of dollars. Just how well it serves the interest of rank and file Aboriginal the Aboriginal people that aren't caught up in the woke politics. How well it's going to serve them rather than the educated elite, which tends to look more white, is an open question. I mean, I live in an area where there's quite a few Aboriginal people, and they don't seem to be doing any better than they were 30 years ago. So where's all this money going? I would love to see Aboriginal people doing better. And there's a place where I go, I have to check in and do all kinds of stuff with the staff at this place. I don't want to say where it is, but there's an Aboriginal woman there, and she's having an opportunity to interact with like all kinds of people from all around the world as well, and to participate in the society and to work and be rewarded. I'm just wondering, God, wouldn't it be wonderful if more Aboriginal people had an opportunity to do that instead of being caught up and they'll go to university and study Aboriginal studies or something like that. Um, I don't think the rank and file is being well served. They've one of the things they put forward is this idea that since they started looking into their roots and restudying the language and all that, they're doing so much better, and so that's a proof that these efforts to like change place names and all of the rest of it is really having an impact. But you have to wonder if those people had just been organized around anything, they wouldn't have benefited. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if Aboriginal people could be encouraged to think of themselves as being the rightful heirs of Western civilization? Because they are the rightful heirs of that. What if they were spending time studying the history of democracy? What if they had an opportunity to visit the Vatican to go and see the magnificent architecture that's in Europe. I mean, they speak English. They live in a country that's governed by the political system set up by the British, the parliamentary system. They are the rightful heirs of that. I'm not saying there isn't any use in Aboriginal studies, that's for sure. A lot can be learned from that, especially about justice, in my opinion. But um, yeah, I just wonder, if we wouldn't get along a lot better if they could have been encouraged to see the positive aspects of Western civilization. It's just not the negatives. And they have the right to freedom of expression, bodily autonomy, informed consent. They enjoy the benefits of that. Why not give them opportunity to appreciate how hard that was to achieve? So what if though we control the present and we write the history that sets the tone for the future? This whole Trudeau nightmare is a chance to do that. We're doing it already. YouTube alone must have tens of thousands of hours of documentation. Books are being written, conversations had, and unfortunately, arguments are also being had. To a certain extent, we're creating the zeitgeist, and we're doing it free of the university system. I think that something that has to be noticed is that the most woke prime minister in Canadian history is also by far the worst. There has to be a lesson taken from that. The academics aren't going to try to pursue that unless they have the freedom to do it, right? Which may be coming as well. By working towards a total denunciation of Justin Trudeau, we work towards a denunciation of woke politics. And not totally, hopefully. It's not as if the wokies never had a point. But what we're thinking, the general consensus is that if you go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, well, they were really justified in what they were doing. They had genuine injustices to fight against. I think most people agree to that. But that over a period of time, it just became a kind of a monster, power grubbing monster. And that's where we are now. We can't get out of a situation where we're wasting all kinds of time and money fighting a fight that was won a long time ago. That's where we're at right now. And that's got to change. Anyway, here they are. They're moving on to the list of embarrassments, failures, list of incompetencies and corruptions that this government is engaged in. They knew about but did nothing CCP interference in at least the last two elections, and because it benefited them. Later, the lying liar lied again when he said this about it. China is trying to interfere, but Canadians alone determine recent elections. Okay, sure. That's why a Chinese diplomat is bragging that she got 3 Liberals elected. The Conservatives are saying that that they shifted 9 seats in Canada. I don't think that's uh, an exaggeration, but could have been more. Uh, Later, he elaborated upon his lie when he said this. He's finally called to give a press conference on this, and he says, foreign governments and actors are trying to undermine people's confidence in democracy itself. Um, and amplifying and giving reasons to mistrust the outcome of an election. mistrust the experts at Elections Canada and in our security forces and our top public servants who are saying that election integrity held. That is something we've seen from elsewhere and is not a good path to go down for society or democracy. So what he's doing at the end there is he's trying to say that we're Trumpians. The people that are concerned about election interference are like uh, the Trumpies who argue that that last election in the United States was corrupt. Well, let's just go through it. So he says foreign governments and actors are trying to undermine people's confidence in democracy itself. Um, well, didn't they say that was a big part of the funding for the trucker convoy? A lot of that was coming from foreign governments and actors. And who is it that's trying to undermine people's confidence in democracy itself? Well, that's you. I mean, you're the one that's doing that. There was an election, and we elected a guy who disrespects so many basic democratic principles that it would be quite understandable if people were starting to lose faith in democracy itself. That's you. So they're trying to undermine people's confidence in democracy itself and amplifying and giving reasons to mistrust the outcome of an election. Um, nobody said that the Conservatives would have won. It's a question of 9 seats, right? And the thing is what they say is, well, if it didn't actually impact the end result, right? One party winning or another, we don't say anything. But the truth of it is, we've got 9 MPs sitting there, uh, so they did impact the election, just not in terms of deciding on a party. So they're giving people reasons to mistrust the outcome of an election, mistrust the experts at Elections Canada, and in our security services and our top public servants who are saying that election integrity held. Yeah, that's how deep the rot is. All of these people that should be protecting from this kind of thing didn't, and they didn't want to tell us anything about it either. And so his thing is that this has come out. People have known about it, but it's a lot clearer now because someone from CSIS had the guts to leak the information. He could lose his job. He could suffer other sorts of uh, punishments as well, I would imagine. And so his concern is to find that leak and to plug it up. That's what he's saying. That's his focus on it. We have to catch the guys who leaked the information to the Canadian public because they needed to know that China's interfering in our elections. He wants to figure out who that guy is and punish him. It's so transparent. It's just right on the face of it. It's um well, it's corrupt and it's absurd. Okay, so just to go through the list, he hired the biased Judge Paul Rouleau to run the Public Order and Emergency Commission. Uh, Humankind, that thing. Okay, the humankind thing. I think he was actually being sarcastic to that woman. The one went on and on. She's talking about how much better everything would be if we conceived of God as female, and so we're sitting here listening, and you can't interrupt a feminist. And he's listening to this, and she used the word mankind, and he interrupted and said humankind. I think he was being sarcastic, but he couldn't own up to it after that, because if he had shown himself to be capable of sarcasm towards a feminist, that would have cost him too many votes. COVID was a political opportunity. That's Christy Freeland. Trudeau used vaccines as a wedge issue. That's Bill Morneau. Okay, just to look back a bit, He pushed to bring in 30,000 refugees from Syria, even after refugee location experts warned that it was too many too fast. He just kept pushing anyway. And what was missed in that is that we could have helped 100 times more people in countries surrounding Syria. It costs a lot of money to bring in a refugee, and if you use that money to uh, help Turkey, or what would have it would have been Turkey took a lot. Uh, anyways, countries surrounding that area. The name of the country that I'm thinking, Jordan, took a lot. If we had taken the money that we spent bringing in refugees and instead sent it to those countries, we could have helped. The figure that I remember is 100 times more people. He ignored United Nations Financial Task Force advice on money laundering, which allowed real estate prices in Canada to be ramped up on profits made selling heroin and now fentanyl to Canadians, thus creating a host of social problems. I mean, that was reported in the news over and over again. Uh, sorry, but it's a lot of it is the Chinese Communist Party coming into Canada, getting all kinds of people addicted on heroin and fentanyl, and using the profits of that to buy real estate and pushing up the prices of real estate. I mean, really, how bad can it get? How bad can it get when that's allowed to happen? You know, the money laundering thing. They claim that there was terrorism financing and money laundering involved in those GoFundMe accounts that were helping the truckers. That was a lie. So much of what they said, terrorism funding and money laundering was involved. The people that were supporting those truckers in the middle of winter going there to stand up for democracy, and they implied that that was what was going on. That's slanderous. I wonder why they couldn't charge them for slander on that. And another thing that they complained about was ideologically motivated violent extremism, or whatever, that phrase is. Yeah, that was bullshit too. Called an election in the middle of the COVID epidemic to capitalize on all the money he was giving out. Attempted to gain total control over the federal budget. Got down on his knees for an organization, BLM, that started hugely destructive riots in black communities across the United States. Did little to alleviate boil water advisories on First Nations. Chrystia Freeland tagged for spreading misinformation on Twitter. That's ironic. Millions spent in pursuit of a useless seat on the useless UN Nations Security Council. Made. Blackface. India trip. He brought Jaspal Atwal. Here's a skinny on him from Wikipedia. Jaspal Atwal is an Indo-Canadian businessman convicted of attempted murder for his role in the 1986 attempt to assassinate Punjab minister Malkiat Singh Sidhu. Sorry about the pronunciation. Singh is a Khalistani sympathizer and member of the now-banned militant group International Sikh Youth Federation. He was also involved in the 1985 attack on Ujaz Dosanjh, a strong opposer of the Khalistani movement, who would later become the 33rd Premier of British Columbia. His comment that Canada is the first post-national state. In other words, our national identities have lost their importance relative to cross-national or supranational global entities such as the WEF, WHO, or NATO. NATO, which currently have us embroiled in another major war. That is going so bad. That is setting up the world for so much difficulty, because what it's doing is it's pushing China and Russia into a closer alliance. And it costs a lot of money, and there's a lot of weaponries involved in that war, and it's being depleted. The CBC right now is running a campaign on air, online, and in posters on public transit, etc., that reads, "It's not how Canadian you are, it's who you are in Canada. It's a Canadian thing." It sure is. And they've been buttering us up for this for a long time. When I was in school under the previous Trudeau government, we were essentially taught to ask, "What is a Canadian?" As though that question had no answer. Or to put it differently, it means nothing to be a Canadian. In every country, citizens eventually get the leaders they deserve. Interesting that in the same year that the United States got Trump, we got Trudeau. That's scary. Sweetie, my wife is walking around. That's why we're getting the little bit of extra noise here. We have to be completely quiet. Thank you. She's a dear. Theresa Tam predicting COVID with eerie accuracy, including the fact that it would come by air from China and possibly require lockdowns, but called us racist for suggesting that Canada limit flights from China at a time when China was limiting domestic flights. China was concerned about the spread, so they weren't letting people fly around in China. The only way that you could fly in China was just if you were going to another country. Do you remember how long they tried to discredit the lab leak hypothesis? Why did they bother with that? Hired Brenda Not So Lucky. Fired Jody Wilson-Raybould for standing up for the rule of law and judicial independence. Or I better have that right. I on the CBC, I saw someone say that she quit because on the CBC they said that she quit because there was so much misogyny and racism in the Canadian political system. Sang a rousing rendition of Bohemian Rhapsody when he went out for a moment from his six-bedroom, $7,000 hotel room. It was 3 bedrooms, $7,000. He's there for the Queen's funeral, and I think it was the day before the ceremony or 2 days before the ceremony. Uh, he went downstairs in the lobby. He was staying in a $7,000 hotel room and sang a rendition of Bohemian Rhapsody, which is fitting because it's a song about a murderous psychopath, after all. Kokanee Grope seems the only sexual harassment he's willing to tolerate is his own. Oh well, like blackface, another learning opportunity for us all. That's how he tried to frame it. Nanny Gate, Elbow Gate, C11, the censorship bill, SNC Lavalin. How many times did you visit the ethics commissioner? How much did you give McKinsey, a company that helped supercharge opioid sales, interfered in French elections, and helped turn Saudi dissidents over to Saudi authorities? Wasn't that long ago, Saudi Arabia had held the biggest mass public execution, I think maybe ever. In public, they lobbed 80 people's heads off. And McKinsey helped turn dissidents over to that government. I wonder what happened to them. Bill Blair pressuring the RCMP to release make and model of guns used in Nova Scotia in order to push their anti-gun agenda. Went surfing in Tofino on the first National Truth and Reconciliation Day, ignoring invitations to spend time with residential school survivors. And here's the thing. Should this be filed under takes too many vacations, or doesn't really like Aboriginal people? Both. But it was a real insult to Aboriginal people, so he doesn't like Aboriginal people. He looks down on Aboriginal people. You can tell. And again, it's from his facial expression, tone of voice, and body language. Conflict of interest. You know, we have Chrystia Freeland working for the WEF, Theresa Tam working for WHO, both globalist institutions, and both receiving a salary. I remember when someone suggested, well, who does she work for? And that was some huge insult, right? Well, like the literal truth is she works for both. She collects the check from both. And Christy Freeland collects a check from WEF. So who does she work for? She works for both. But it was somehow insulting to insinuate that they might be more loyal to one employer than another. Especially when the one employer is Canada, a country with no national identity. The constant, oh so compassionate while I knife you in the back, condescending tone of voice that he uses. Digital ID that many think is a little too reminiscent of the social credit system in China. I don't know enough about that to comment much, but that's what some people are saying. Under this government, Canada signed on to UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, a move that even Jody Wilson said was untenable because it would be too expensive. Took a day off for anniversary celebration, for his wedding anniversary celebration in the middle of a G7 summit. The other G7 leaders, well, what are you doing? Taking a day off in the middle of this? The failed gender neutral cabinet, which has been infiltrated by the WEF, Charles Schwab, all the best prime ministers. Oh, no, okay. Yeah, he said all the top cabinet in Canada. He bragged about that. Had been trained by the World Economic Forum. What about his comment that all the best prime ministers have been from Quebec? This country belongs to us, I think, to Quebecers. I think he said that. That was Trudeau on a French television show. His boastful claim that he ordered the U.S. military to shoot down the Chinese spy balloon. You know, it was just amazing to watch him. He came out and he said, yeah, I ordered the United States to do that. Really, how do you think that Americans felt about that? Trip to the Aga Khan's Island, the Arrive scam app, the botched missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls inquiry that did almost nothing but re-traumatize victims. And he admitted that Canada was involved in an ongoing genocide, which means he should be in jail. Roxham Road, excessive travel, exorbitant and blatant overspending on luxurious accommodation, meals, and wine. In 1 month, the Trudeau family spent $12,000 on groceries. And in related news, Nannygate again. 282 delegates flown to the Paris climate change meeting in 2015, twice what the Americans spent and 3 times what the Brits sent. This year, the thing happens on a luxury island off the coast of Egypt. Looks set to be the poshest affair yet, with the strictest control of journalists, most likely. An island location was probably chosen for that purpose. His unjustified invocation of the Emergencies Act, his taunting of protesters, his half-assed performance in UN peacekeeping mission, wasted $1 billion of vaccines by letting them expire or sit unrefrigerated, and appear to be on the hook for $4 billion more. Under this government, we raided COVAX, the supply of vaccines that was intended for poor countries. No other G7 country did that. Ignored democratic Taiwan in favor of China in terms of the threat that COVID posed. Hired known racist, anti-racist Laith Marouf to become federal anti-racism secretariat. Laith referred to Jews as loudmouth bags of human feces and called Colin Powell a Jamaican house slave and rejoiced at his death. The time he responded to an elderly woman complaining that she could not receive medical care in English and French. So the old lady's there, and she's saying, I can't get proper medical care in Quebec because I can't speak French. And he responded to her in French. The botched missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls inquiry that did almost nothing but re-traumatize victims, after which he admitted that Canada is engaged in an ongoing genocide of Aboriginal people. An ongoing genocide of Aboriginal people, complete with apologies, billions paid out in compensation, several times, land acknowledgements. Anyway, like I said before, he's the dear leader of Canada. If we're engaged in genocide, he should be on trial for it in the international court. Government policy of awarding contracts to female-owned businesses. Sunny ways, the mess at immigration, the mess at airports, national unity. Alberta's already well on their way towards dissociating themselves from the federal government. I mean, that's Prime Minister's job is to maintain, is to keep Canada together. C11, the internet censorship bill, going after hunting rifles after assuring us that he would not. The debt will balance itself. I don't think a lot about fiscal policy. There's a quote I just thought I'd throw in here. If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such time as the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and/or military consequences of the lie. It thus becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent. For the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. That certainly appears to be the case here. Okay, flip-flop on the F-35s. The RCMP contracting with Sinclair, a Chinese company for sensitive electronic equipment. The Liberal MP from Brampton, Shafkat Ali, who participated in a House session from a bathroom stall. They knew it was from a bathroom stall, apparently, by just what it looked like, by the disgust on their faces. Like, that's never been asked. We absolutely know that a Liberal MP participated in the House of Commons debate from a bathroom stall. And I'd like to know, did you know it was a bathroom stall because of what it looked like, or did you know because of what it sounded like? Talk about dumping on your adoptive country. He later apologized for the unfortunate incident that happened, rather than apologizing for what he did. I saw that apology. It's a non-apology. It's an insult apology. You can tell he didn't feel bad about it at all, right? And he didn't apologize for what he did. He apologized for an unfortunate incident. In other words, he didn't apologize at all, and we didn't ask him to. That's a level of disrespect shown to our parliamentary system that shouldn't be tolerated. And we just let him go. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the people that he knows, they probably had a really good laugh at it. Really good laugh about it, I'm sorry. 6.8 million in payments to a single Calgary hotel that quarantined a total of 10 people. Lowered the Canadian flag in reaction to the discovery of unmarked graves and said, no, it's up to Aboriginal people when it can go back up again. Well, no. It isn't just up to them. And it was in reaction to the discovery of unmarked graves, which were frequently and slanderously referred to as mass graves, which wasn't a discovery at all. They were not discovered. They were located. Aboriginal people knew that those graveyards were there. And so they ignored the knowledge of Aboriginal people to cook up this story that made Canada look a lot worse than it is. They weren't mass graves, and they weren't discovered. They were single graves that Aboriginal people knew were there. What did they think? They lived through Spanish flu, lived through a time when Canada didn't have, nobody had the medical advances that we have today. World War I, World War II. I mean, people die, right? Which isn't to say that... There was a quote recently from Anna Arndt. She's probably the person who knows more about totalitarian governments than any. And she said one of the things that they do and that really makes them successful is that they take a statement of truth and turn it into a statement of motive, right? So if I say, I don't believe that those kids were murdered, right? Because I don't believe the story that's been told about mass graves and this discovery. I think that this is absolutely overblown. And I think that when people die, we have a tradition of burial. So they'll interpret that as a motive. They'll say, oh, so you want to discredit criticisms of the residential school system. Well, yeah, I want to discredit unreasonable criticism. Doesn't mean that I want to discredit all criticism. Anyway, Anna Arndt, Hannah Arndt is a great person to look for if you want to see someone who knew more about uh, the Nazis and communists than anybody. How about the desecration of monuments under his watch, including those of John A. Macdonald, Queen Elizabeth, and Queen Victoria, whose head was later found in the Assiniboine River? Trudeau steadfastly refused to apologize for calling two Jewish conservative members Nazis in the House of Commons for showing sympathy for the Freedom Convoy. The Jewish members stood up and told him how hurtful that comment was, and others tried to convince him by explaining that the freedom movement did not include Nazis, and if it did, Jewish members would not be allowed. There was a Nazi flag there, but it was flown from a government building that was difficult to access. We know that a lot of claims of racism and such are cooked up. So the Nazi flag was there, and it was flown from a government office that was hard to locate. So you can infer what you like from that, but the flag certainly did a lot for the effort to paint the protesters as misogynistic, homophobes, Nazis itself. Thanks for the donation. That's what he said to the Aboriginal protester from Grassy Narrows. He doesn't like Aboriginal people, doesn't respect them. That's for sure. So, anyway, I hope that's a decent start at a complete list of Justin Trudeau's what mistakes. I don't think that I think that a lot of what he did he intended to do. So I wouldn't call them mistakes.